I never believed in miracles. Not really. Oh, I'd heard the stories my whole life. Sunday school tales that felt more like fairy tales. Ancient accounts that seemed impossibly distant from my Monday morning commute and my evening Netflix binges. But there was something. A hunger, maybe. A restless ache in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. When the world felt thin somehow, like reality itself was just a curtain waiting to be pulled back. I told myself it was just anxiety, just the weight of another meaningless day, in an endless parade of meaningless days. But deep down, deeper than I cared to admit, I was searching for something, anything, that would prove this life was more than just biology and bills and the slow march toward irrelevance. The artifact appeared on a Tuesday that would forever divide my existence into before and after. I'd been cleaning out my grandmother's attic, 3 months after her funeral, wading through decades of accumulated memories and forgotten treasures that spoke of a life lived in quiet faith I'd never understood. Most of it was destined for donation bins, moth-eaten sweaters that still held the ghost of her perfume, yellowed photographs of people whose names had died with her, china that would never again hold Sunday dinner conversations where she'd speak of miracles as casually as weather forecasts. The dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light, and I found myself moving through her belongings like an archaeologist excavating the remnants of belief I'd never possessed. But then my fingers found it, buried beneath layers of tissue paper in a wooden box that seemed older than the house itself, older than memory. Older, perhaps, than the very foundations of recorded time. The moment I touched it, the world shifted. Just slightly. Like when you're walking upstairs in the dark and expect one more step than there is. That brief moment when reality doesn't match expectation and your stomach drops into free fall. Except this fall seemed to stretch across centuries. It was a staff, ancient beyond measure, worn smooth by countless hands, carved from wood that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it, as if it had absorbed the radiance of 1,000 sunrises and held them deep within its grain. The craftsmanship was unlike anything I'd ever seen. No machine could have created these intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in wood, these symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained meaning too vast for human comprehension. The moment my palm closed around it, I felt it. A pulse, subtle but unmistakable, like the staff had its own heartbeat, its own living essence that recognized something in me I didn't even know existed. The room around me began to blur at the edges, colors bleeding together like watercolors in rain, and I had the strangest sensation that I was standing at the edge of an enormous precipice, staring down into depths that existed somewhere else entirely, somewhere else, someone else. The very air seemed to thicken, charged with electricity that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. And I could hear something. A sound like distant thunder, like the crash of waves against primordial shores, like the beating of wings large enough to shadow continents. I should have put it down, should have wrapped it back up and donated it with everything else, should have fled that attic and never looked back. But the hunger I'd carried for so long, that gnawing emptiness that no amount of success or comfort or distraction could fill, it recognized something in that wood. Something that called to the deepest part of my soul like a lighthouse, calling to ships lost in fog, like a voice speaking a name I'd forgotten I possessed. The first journey happened by accident, or perhaps by design orchestrated by intelligence far beyond my own. I was holding the staff, running my thumb along its surface, wondering about its origin, imagining the hands that had shaped it, the ceremonies it might have witnessed, the power it might have channeled, when the world simply dissolved. One moment I was standing in grandmother's attic, surrounded by dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight. The next I was stumbling across sand dunes, under a sky so vast and brilliant it made my eyes water, so impossibly wide it seemed to curve beyond the edges of existence itself. The transition wasn't violent. It was more like stepping from one room into another. If rooms could exist 3,000 years apart, if doorways could span the gulf between epochs. But the sensation was overwhelming nonetheless, a cosmic displacement that left me gasping and disoriented, my modern mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. I was no longer in Kansas, Dorothy. I was somewhere far stranger, far more dangerous, far more alive with possibility than Oz could ever be. I found myself in the ancient world, but not as an observer watching from some invisible gallery or viewing events through the safe distance of historical documentary. I was there. Truly there, occupying space and breathing air and casting shadows in a time when the earth was young and gods walked among mortals, and the impossible was merely another word for Tuesday. I was wearing robes that felt real against my skin, rough woven fabric that spoke of sheep grazing in fields that had turned to dust millennia before my birth, sandals that gripped sand still warm from a sun that had witnessed the dawn of civilization. Around me, scattered like seeds across the wilderness, spread a sight that stole my breath and stopped my heart: the children of Israel. Not the sanitized Sunday school version I'd grown up with, not the Hollywood epic with perfect makeup and orchestral swells, but the raw, overwhelming reality of an entire nation on the move. Hundreds of thousands of them, maybe more. Men and women and children and elderly. Their faces etched with exhaustion and hope, and the kind of desperate faith that comes only from having nowhere else to turn, from having staked everything on promises that seemed as impossible as the journey itself. This was the stuff of legend made flesh, mythology walking upright under desert stars. These were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the people chosen by the God of creation to be his own, to carry his name and his promises through the corridors of history. They moved like a living river across the desert, a migration so vast it defied comprehension. Families carrying everything they owned on their backs, herders driving flocks that kicked up dust clouds visible from orbit, children running between the legs of adults, their laughter mixing with prayers in languages that predated Babel. But it was Moses who made my breath catch in my throat, who turned my skeptical modern heart into a believer in the span of a single glance. I'd seen him in movies, in paintings, depicted as some ethereal saint with perfect hair and glowing skin, a sanitized religious icon bearing little resemblance to actual humanity. This Moses was different, weathered by decades in the wilderness, ancient beyond his years, bearing the weight of leading an entire people through circumstances that would have broken lesser men. His face was carved by decades of conversation with the divine, marked by the responsibility of being chosen for something far beyond human comprehension, etched with the terrible beauty of one who had stood in the presence of the Almighty and lived to tell the tale. His beard was white as the snows of Sinai, his hands gnarled like desert thorns, his back bent with age and responsibility, and the crushing weight of carrying God's word to a people who alternately followed him with desperate faith and rebelled against him with spectacular ingratitude. When he looked at me, just once, his eyes held depths I couldn't fathom, not just wisdom, but the terrible knowledge that comes from standing in the presence of the Creator of the universe, from receiving the divine law written by the finger of God, from serving as the bridge between heaven and earth. And ahead of us, imposing and magnificent and absolutely impassable, stretched the Red Sea. The name didn't do it justice. This was no mere body of water, no simple geographical obstacle to be navigated with boats and good weather. This was a living barrier, a wall of liquid crystal that caught the light like molten metal, waves rolling endlessly toward shores that disappeared into hazy distance, each crest crowned with foam that sparkled like diamonds in the brutal desert sun. The water was deeper than mountains are high, wider than valleys are broad, more ancient than the pyramids that had watched over Egypt for generations beyond counting. I stood at its edge and felt the immensity of it, the crushing weight of all that water suspended above abyssal depths where leviathans dwelt in darkness and pressure that would crumple human bone like paper. The sound of it was hypnotic, terrifying, beautiful, the eternal rhythm of tides that had pounded these shores since the dawn of creation, the voice of waters that had covered the earth in the beginning, when darkness was upon the face of the deep and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters. Behind us, growing closer with each passing hour, like some inexorable tide of destruction, the dust cloud that marked Pharaoh's army grew larger, more menacing, more terrible in its implications. 600 chariots, the finest military force in the ancient world, bearing down on a mass of former slaves, with nowhere to run and nothing but their faith to shield them. These were not the cartoon villains of children's stories. These were professional killers, warriors trained from birth in the arts of war, equipped with bronze weapons and composite bows and horses bred for speed and endurance. Their commander was no fool, no arrogant despot stumbling blindly into divine judgment. This was military genius at work, tactical brilliance, employed in service of evil, but genius nonetheless. He had driven the Israelites to this exact spot, with surgical precision, herding them like cattle toward the slaughter, cutting off every avenue of escape until they stood with their backs to the sea and death approaching from behind, like some vast, hungry beast. I felt it then. Not just the physical impossibility of the situation, but the spiritual weight of it, the cosmic significance of this moment balanced on the knife's edge between deliverance and destruction. These people had followed Moses out of bondage, trusting in promises that must have seemed as impossible as the sea now blocking their path, as unlikely as freedom itself. They had left behind the only life they'd ever known, the familiar misery of slavery that at least offered the comfort of predictability, and stepped into uncertainty guided by pillars of cloud and fire that defied every law of physics and common sense. They had seen miracles already, the plagues that had brought Egypt to its knees, the Passover that had spared their firstborn while death stalked the houses of their oppressors. The very hand of God working wonders that should have convinced any reasonable person that the God of Abraham was exactly who he claimed to be. But human nature is a strange thing. Memory fades, and in the face of immediate physical danger, even divine miracles can seem as distant as childhood dreams. The murmuring started low, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, a susurrus of fear and doubt and dawning desperation that grew louder with each passing moment. Voices raised in fear, in anger, in desperate questioning that echoed across the desert like accusations hurled at heaven itself. Why had Moses brought them here to die? Why had God delivered them from slavery only to abandon them at the shore like some cosmic joke, some divine trick played at their expense? Were they better off as slaves in Egypt than as corpses in the wilderness? I found myself swept up in their terror, feeling the collective panic of a people who had staked everything on divine promises that now seemed as distant as stars, as unreliable as desert mirages. The weight of their fear was crushing, a psychological pressure that made the physical heat of the desert seem cool by comparison. This was what it felt like to stand at the end of the world with no options left, no clever plans or backup strategies or contingency protocols. Just raw, desperate, absolute dependence on a God who seemed to have gone silent just when his people needed him most. Children were crying, their wails cutting through adult conversation like knives through silk. Innocent voices raised in confusion and terror at the inexplicable situation their parents had led them into. Women clutched infants to their breasts and wondered if this barren shore would be the last thing their babies ever saw. Men gripped weapons that seemed pathetically inadequate against 600 chariots, their faces set in the grim determination of those who would die fighting rather than return to slavery. And through it all, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, the dust cloud larger, the reality of their situation more inescapable with each heartbeat. Death was coming, professional and efficient and unstoppable, and there was nowhere to run. But Moses raised the staff, the same type of staff I held in my own hands, though his bore the weight of miracles I could scarcely imagine, had channeled power that had brought the mightiest empire on earth to its knees, and led an entire nation through the wilderness, on nothing but faith and divine provision. This was the staff that had turned the Nile to blood, that had called forth frogs and gnats and flies, that had struck Egypt with boils and hail and locusts and darkness so thick it could be felt. And in that moment, as his arm lifted toward heaven, as his weathered fingers tightened around wood carved by hands long dead, the very air around us seemed to hold its breath. The winds stopped, not gradually, not with the natural ebb and flow of desert breezes, but instantly, completely, as if the atmosphere itself had been commanded to stillness. The waves stilled, their eternal rhythm interrupted for the first time since creation, their foam-crowned peaks frozen like sculptures of liquid crystal. Even the children fell silent, their cries dying in their throats as they sensed something vast and terrible and wonderful approaching, some presence so immense it dwarfed human understanding, so alien to ordinary experience that it could only be processed as raw awe. The horses of Pharaoh's army whinnied in terror, their primal instincts recognizing the approach of power that made their human masters seem like insects by comparison. And then Moses spoke, not shouted, not screamed, but spoke in a voice that carried the authority of one who had conversed with the Creator face to face, who had stood in the presence of the burning bush and lived to tell the tale, who bore in his very bones the memory of divine fire and glory that would have consumed lesser men like paper in a furnace. His words were in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew that predated kingdoms and empires, but somehow I understood them, felt their meaning resonate in my soul like struck crystal. "Fear not. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." What happened next defied every law of physics I'd ever learned, every rational explanation my modern mind tried to construct, every scientific principle that governed the ordered universe I thought I understood. The sea parted, not gradually, not with the slow obedience of natural forces responding to earthquake or wind or gravitational anomaly, but with the sudden, absolute, overwhelming authority of divine command, spoken by the voice that called light out of darkness and shaped galaxies with a word. The water rose, not like waves, not like tsunami or tidal surge, but like liquid walls, towering impossibly high on either side. Tons upon tons of water suspended in defiance of gravity and physics and common sense, held in place by power that made the forces that bind atoms seem like gentle suggestions. Each wall stretched higher than skyscrapers, broader than city blocks, deeper than the foundations of mountains, containing volumes of water that could have drowned continents. And between those walls, where moments before had stretched fathoms of churning sea, lay dry ground. Not muddy seabed or treacherous marsh that would trap wheels and hooves, not the soggy remnants of recent ocean floor, but firm, solid earth that looked as if it had been dry for centuries, as if the sea had never existed there at all, as if creation itself had been locally rewritten to accommodate the passage of God's chosen people. The light filtering through the water walls cast everything in an ethereal blue-green glow, turning the crossing into a cathedral of liquid crystal and divine authority, a sanctuary more beautiful and terrible than any temple built by human hands. Within those translucent walls, marine life swam in confused circles, fish and rays and creatures I couldn't name, all suspended in their liquid prison, their normal world suddenly transformed into something alien and incomprehensible. I walked with them, step by step, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people crossing on dry ground through the bottom of the sea, experiencing what no human being had ever experienced before or would again, participating in a miracle so vast it redefined the possible. The ground beneath our feet was solid as granite, warm as summer earth, marked by the footprints of 1,000,000 sandals, but never becoming muddy or unstable, despite the massive weight of an entire nation in transit. The walls of water on either side rose higher than any building I'd ever seen, teeming with fish and marine life suspended in their liquid imprisonment, all held back by the same word that spoke light into existence and breathed life into dust. Whales hung motionless in that crystal medium, their massive forms as still as sculptures, their ancient eyes reflecting light that had never shone in such circumstances before. Sharks glided through their transformed element like confused ghosts, their predatory instincts useless in a world suddenly redefined by forces beyond their comprehension. Children laughed and ran ahead, their fear transformed into wonder by the sheer impossibility of what they were experiencing, their young minds accepting the miraculous with the easy faith that adults had learned to question. They pointed at fish suspended in the walls, chased each other between the legs of adults, turned what should have been the most terrifying journey in human history into an adventure of cosmic proportions. Adults wept as they walked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were experiencing, struck dumb by the realization that the God they served was not some distant philosophical concept, but a living, active, overwhelmingly powerful being who could reshape reality itself to protect his people. This wasn't just a convenient rescue. This was the creator of the universe demonstrating his power over creation itself, revealing his character to a people he had chosen to be his own, writing his name across history in letters of liquid crystal and divine authority. I reached out once, unable to resist, and touched the wall of water beside me. It was solid as glass, warm as blood, pulsing with life and energy that made my fingers tingle and my heart race. Through it, I could see the depths of the sea continuing down into blue-black mystery, fathoms upon fathoms of water compressed into a space that should have been impossible to contain. Strange creatures moved in those depths, things with too many eyes, tentacles that spanned impossible distances, forms that seemed to shift and change as I watched, reminders that the sea held secrets that predated human civilization. The water didn't wet my hand, it simply held, suspended by the same power that holds stars in their courses and keeps planets spinning in perfect harmony. the same force that maintains the delicate balance between matter and energy that allows reality to exist at all. I could feel the pressure of it, the tremendous weight straining against divine command, held back not by any physical barrier, but by the simple, absolute will of the one who had set the boundaries of the seas at creation, and commanded them not to be passed. Behind us, Pharaoh's chariots had reached the shore. I could hear their war cries echoing off the liquid walls, the thunder of wheels and hooves on desert sand, the crack of whips and the shouts of commanders who thought they were pursuing helpless refugees and found themselves confronting the raw power of the divine. They plunged into the crossing without hesitation, their horses' hooves finding the same firm footing that had supported the Israelites, their bronze weapons glinting in the strange light that filtered through walls of suspended sea. For a moment, terror gripped my heart. Surely they would overtake us. Surely this miraculous deliverance would end in slaughter. After all, surely the God who had brought us this far would not abandon us at the moment of victory. The thunder of pursuit grew louder, more urgent, more threatening, and I found myself running with the others, my modern cynicism completely obliterated by the very real fear of very real death approaching from behind. But Pharaoh's army was about to learn what it meant to pursue the people of the Most High God into a space where the normal rules of reality had been suspended by divine decree. Their chariots began to struggle, wheels coming loose, axles breaking under strain that should not have affected the finest military hardware in the ancient world. Horses stumbled and fell, their hooves finding purchase on ground that had been perfectly solid moments before. The same divine power that had provided safe passage for the Israelites began to work against their oppressors, turning their strength into weakness, their advantage into liability. The army that had terrorized Egypt, that had crushed rebellion and conquered nations, found itself helpless against forces beyond human comprehension. Chariots designed to be weapons of war became death traps, their occupants trapped and vulnerable in vehicles that had suddenly become more dangerous than safety. The elite warriors of Pharaoh, trained from birth in the arts of combat, discovered that all their skill meant nothing when facing power that could reshape the fundamental laws of physics. But then Moses raised the staff again. From the far shore where the last of the Israelites had reached safety, where old and young alike stood watching the final act of their deliverance play out behind them, he stretched out his hand over the sea. And for a moment, just a moment, I could see the strain in his ancient frame, the physical cost of channeling divine power through mortal flesh, the terrible responsibility of serving as the instrument through which God worked his will in the world. And the walls collapsed. I had never imagined such power, such terrible and magnificent force unleashed in service of justice and protection. The walls of water crashed together with a sound like the end of the world, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, that echoed off mountain peaks and rolled across desert valleys and penetrated to the core of every human heart within 100 miles. The sea returned to its place in an instant, millions of gallons of water reclaiming their natural position with a violence that redefined my understanding of the forces that govern our universe. The sound was indescribable. Imagine every thunderstorm in history concentrated into a single moment. Every earthquake and volcanic eruption and hurricane compressed into one cosmic percussion that seemed to originate not just from the collision of waters, but from the very fabric of reality being rewoven in real time. The earth shook beneath our feet. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the aftermath of forces too great for human senses to fully process. The sea swallowed chariots and horses and riders in one tremendous final surge, tons of water crashing down on the finest military force in the ancient world with the weight of divine judgment. Where moments before had stretched dry ground marked by the footprints of 1,000,000 sandals, now rolled the same endless expanse of water that had blocked their path, as if the crossing had never happened, as if the laws of physics had never been suspended, as if 600 chariots had simply vanished into legend. But they had not vanished. They had been consumed, devoured by the same waters that had stood aside for the passage of God's people, destroyed by the same power that had provided miraculous deliverance. Pharaoh's army, the terror of nations, the instrument of oppression that had held an entire people in bondage, was gone, erased from history in a display of divine justice that would echo through the ages. The silence that followed was profound, absolute, sacred. The kind of silence that follows resurrection, that attends the presence of the divine, that marks the boundary between the ordinary and the eternal. The waves lapped peacefully at the shore, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as if the greatest miracle in human history was just another Tuesday afternoon by the seaside. But the absence of 600 chariots spoke louder than any sound could have, testified to power beyond human comprehension deployed in defense of the helpless. And then the singing began. Miriam, Moses, sister, prophetess in her own right, woman who had watched over her infant brother when he floated among the reeds of the Nile, took up a tambourine and began to dance, her voice rising in triumph and praise that seemed to lift the very sky. Her song was not mere celebration, but prophecy, not simple gratitude, but cosmic recognition of what had just transpired, the intervention of the Almighty in human history, the revelation of divine character in terms too dramatic to be ignored or explained away. Other women joined her, and then the men, until the entire multitude was caught up in celebration that echoed across the desert and rolled back from the mountains beyond, a song of deliverance that would be sung for millennia, that would become the template for every hymn of victory and psalm of praise ever composed. They sang of salvation, of deliverance, of the God who fights for his people and makes ways where there is no way, who demonstrates his love not through sentiment, but through acts of power that reshape reality itself. This was more than a rescue. It was revelation, divine self-disclosure on a scale that dwarfed every other miracle in human experience. The God of Abraham had revealed himself not as distant philosopher or abstract concept, but as living, active, overwhelmingly powerful protector of his people, willing to suspend the laws of nature itself to fulfill his promises. The same voice that had spoken galaxies into existence had commanded the sea to stand aside, and creation itself had rushed to obey. I stood among them, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had witnessed. My skeptical modern heart shattered and rebuilt in the span of a single afternoon. This wasn't mythology or metaphor or ancient exaggeration passed down through generations of storytellers who had embellished simple events into spectacular legend. This was history, raw, real, undeniable history that proved beyond question that the God of Israel was exactly who he claimed to be. The Creator, the Deliverer, the one who splits seas and stops armies and transforms impossible situations into testimonies of his power and love. The same God who had walked with Adam in the garden, who had called Abraham out of Ur, who had wrestled with Jacob and spoken to Moses from the burning bush, had just demonstrated his sovereignty over the natural world in a display that would echo through history until the end of time. The staff in my hands pulsed again, gentler now, like a heart settling back into rhythm after intense exertion, like the contented sigh of power properly exercised in service of justice and mercy. The world began to blur at the edges, colors running together like paint in rain, and I felt myself being pulled back across the centuries to grandmother's attic and fluorescent lights, and the comfortable prison of modern skepticism that I would never again be able to inhabit with the same confidence. But I was different now, fundamentally, irreversibly, eternally changed. I had seen the impossible made manifest, had walked on ground that should have been ocean floor, had witnessed the God of the universe demonstrate his sovereignty over the natural world in a display of power that dwarfed every human achievement in history combined and multiplied by infinity. The hunger that had gnawed at me for years was gone, replaced by a certainty so profound it had rewritten the very foundation of my understanding. I carefully wrapped the staff in tissue paper and placed it back in its box, but my hands trembled as I did so, shaking with the after effects of witnessing the divine at work, of being present for one of the defining moments in human history. But I would return to it, again and again, because some truths are too magnificent to witness only once, too important to be relegated to the realm of one-time experience. And each time I held it, each time I allowed it to carry me back across the millennia to witness the works of the Almighty, I returned more convinced that the stories I'd dismissed as fairy tales were actually the most important historical accounts ever recorded. The God who parted the Red Sea for Moses still moves in power today, still makes ways where there is no way, still demonstrates his love for his people in ways that defy explanation but demand response. The Monday morning commute hasn't changed. Netflix still offers its endless stream of distraction. Bills still arrive with depressing regularity. and the fluorescent lights of modern life still flicker with the same heartless efficiency. But now, in those quiet moments between sleep and waking, when the world feels thin and reality seems like a curtain waiting to be pulled back, I don't feel the old hungry ache. I feel anticipation, expectation, the thrilling awareness that I serve a God who specializes in the impossible. Because I know now what lies beyond the curtain. I know the God who spoke the universe into existence is still speaking, still moving, still splitting seas for anyone brave enough to trust him with their impossibilities. I have seen his power unleashed in defense of his people, witnessed his love expressed through acts that transcend human imagination, participated in miracles that prove beyond doubt that faith is not blind. But the most rational response to a God who backs his promises with demonstrations of power that reshape reality itself. And sometimes, when I'm stuck in traffic or overwhelmed by the weight of ordinary life, when the problems of existence seem insurmountable and the future appears bleak and hopeless, I close my eyes and remember the sound of a million sandals crossing on dry ground, the sight of liquid walls held back by divine command, the feeling of walking through the impossible, made possible by the God who specializes in doing what cannot be done. And in those moments, Monday mornings become less like prison sentences and more like preparations for the next miracle waiting to unfold, opportunities to witness the same power that split the Red Sea, working in and through ordinary lives, surrendered to extraordinary purposes. The staff sits in its box, patient and ready, a doorway to divine encounters that prove again and again that the God of Moses is still the God of today, still working wonders, still making ways where there is no way, still demonstrating that faith is not foolishness, but the most reasonable response to a God who makes the impossible his specialty.